The apartment door was quiet, almost too quiet, when police finally pushed it open. Inside, the dim light cast shadows on walls that should have held nothing more sinister than the remnants of an ordinary life. But on that May evening in 2020, in the small town of Sikeston, Missouri, officers stumbled upon a scene that would forever change the way the community remembered Nina Pop. There, lying motionless, her body bore the marks of a violent end. She was only 28 years old. It wasn't just the brutality of the scene that chilled investigators. It was the silence. No cries for help. No last words. No warning that her life was about to be cut short. Only a haunting stillness that seemed to scream louder than anything else. In that silence lay a question that would echo far beyond the walls of that apartment. Why, Nina? Why now? But before we can understand what happened in that apartment, before we can even begin to piece together how her story took such a devastating turn, we need to step back and ask, who was Nina Pop? Nina's story doesn't begin with tragedy. It begins with life, laughter, and a woman determined to carve out her own identity in a world that too often refused to see people like her clearly. She was born and raised in Missouri, a place where small-town roots ran deep and where everybody seemed to know everybody else. Those who knew Nina described her as vibrant, someone whose smile had the ability to light up a room and whose presence was magnetic. She was also a Black transgender woman, a part of her identity that came with both strength and vulnerability. In rural communities, where acceptance could be harder to come by, Nina lived authentically, refusing to hide who she was. For many in her life, she represented courage, someone who walked into the world every day as herself, no matter the risks. But courage doesn't make someone untouchable, and in Nina's case, it seemed to put her in danger. In the months leading up to her death, the world around her was already heavy. The year was 2020, a time when tensions were running high across the country. The pandemic had taken hold, shutting down communities, straining relationships, and leaving many people isolated. On top of that, violence against transgender women, particularly transgender women of color, was spiking at alarming rates. Every few weeks, headlines would carry another name, another life lost too soon. And though Nina couldn't have known she would one day be part of that list, the shadows of that danger were never far from her. Friends remembered her as someone who wanted nothing more than stability, a sense of belonging, and the chance to live in peace. She had dreams that stretched beyond the quiet town of Sikeston, yet she remained there, building her life one day at a time. The day of May 3rd began like any other. At least, that's how it appeared from the outside. Nina went about her usual routines, keeping in touch with friends, posting updates, living her life in the small ways that people do when they assume tomorrow will be just another day. No one knew that within hours, her name would be etched into the growing, heartbreaking list of transgender women who had lost their lives to violence. When officers discovered her body, the initial shock was followed by an unsettling realization. This wasn't a random act. The way her body was found told them there had been rage, intent, and a chilling intimacy. Whoever had done this had been close enough to take her life up close. News of Nina's death spread quickly, not just in Sikeston, but across the country. Within hours, her name trended online, sparking an outcry from activists and organizations who had grown weary of adding yet another Black transgender woman to the year's grim toll. She wasn't just another statistic, she was a person, loved by many, with her own story. Yet now, she had been silenced. As vigils began to form and candles flickered in her memory, people couldn't help but ask, had Nina seen the danger coming? Had she trusted the wrong person? Or was her death the result of a hate crime that could have been prevented? The investigation that followed would reveal troubling details about her final hours, details that pointed towards someone she had once let into her world. And as those details unfolded, they would expose a dark reality not only about her death, but about the risks faced daily by transgender women like her. But for now, in part 1, we are left with only the image of that silent apartment, of officers stepping into a room where life had been so violently erased, and of a community left reeling, searching for answers. What does it say about a society when someone like Nina, who lived bravely and openly, could be struck down in such a brutal way? Was her life stolen because of who she was, or because of who she trusted? One thing is certain. This story is only just beginning, and the truth still hidden within it may be more disturbing than anyone can imagine. So, stay with me. There's a lot more to this story that will leave you speechless. If you find it worth listening to, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. When investigators closed the door to Nina's apartment that night, they carried more than just evidence bags. They carried a responsibility to uncover who had done this and why. But in the first few hours, the silence of the crime scene pressed on them heavily. Nothing about the room screamed robbery. Nothing suggested a break-in. Whoever had entered Nina's life that night had done so by invitation, or at least by familiarity. That detail alone unsettled detectives, because it meant the suspect might not be a stranger at all. The town of Sikeston wasn't a place that often made national headlines. Nestled in Missouri's southeastern corner, it was the kind of community where people exchanged waves at the gas station, and where news traveled faster by word of mouth than through official channels. When Nina's death was announced, it didn't just ripple through the local community. It tore through it. For those who knew her, grief was heavy, but beneath it lurked suspicion. People began asking, who could Nina have trusted enough to let into her apartment, and who among them carried the kind of anger that could turn deadly? Police canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, retracing Nina's last movements. Friends told them she'd been in contact with someone new, a man whose name they didn't all know but whose presence had made them uneasy. Nina, ever trusting and hopeful, had tried to give him a chance. That small detail, a new connection, perhaps romantic, perhaps casual, gave investigators their first thread. They pulled cell phone records, piecing together the final communications that painted the hours before her death. Texts, calls, and the digital footprints we all leave behind told them that Nina hadn't spent her last night alone. Someone had been there with her. As detectives worked, word of Nina's death reached advocacy groups beyond Missouri. The Human Rights Campaign released statements calling for justice, highlighting the tragic reality that Nina was already the 10th transgender person reported killed in the United States in 2020, and the year was only in its 5th month. To many, her death wasn't just about Sikeston. It was about the larger epidemic of violence against transgender women of color. Yet while national voices cried out, on the ground in Sikeston the work remained painstaking and slow. Every lead had to be checked, every alibi tested. Officers knew that one wrong assumption could let a killer slip through their fingers. Within days, their suspicions began to tighten around one man, 8-year-old James Wilson. He wasn't a stranger to Nina. Their paths had crossed in ways that blurred the lines between casual acquaintance and something more. To friends, His presence in her life had been sudden and unsettling. To police, he became a name they couldn't ignore. Wilson was not unknown to law enforcement. His past carried its own shadows, minor charges, brushes with the law, the kind of background that painted him as unpredictable. But unpredictability alone wasn't evidence of murder. What investigators needed was proof that he had been with Nina in those final hours, and that the encounter had turned violent. Cell phone records placed him near her apartment the night she died. Witness statements hinted at his volatile nature, and the evidence inside her apartment suggested intimacy before violence, a chilling reminder of how quickly trust can shatter. When detectives finally tracked him down, Wilson didn't give them the answers they wanted. His story shifted, his tone defensive. He admitted knowing Nina, but insisted he had nothing to do with her death. Yet the inconsistencies piled up, and the weight of the evidence began to corner him. Still, one question loomed large. Was Nina's death a hate crime? Was she targeted because she was a transgender woman? Or was this a personal relationship that turned deadly? Investigators wrestled with that distinction, and the community demanded clarity. For Nina's friends, the answer felt obvious. Her identity had always made her vulnerable. But in the eyes of the law, motive mattered. And proving hate as a motivator required more than suspicion. It required undeniable evidence. As days turned into weeks, Nina's name continued to circulate across the country. Vigils were held not only in Missouri but in cities hundreds of miles away. Her face appeared on posters, in hashtags, in chants calling for justice. Yet in Sikeston, people were left with a more haunting reality. A killer still walked among them. The police believed they were close, but proving guilt and assigning motive are two different battles. Wilson remained in their sights, but without a confession, without irrefutable proof, questions lingered. And those questions weighed heavily on a community already fractured by grief and fear. For Nina's friends, the silence was unbearable. How many times had they warned her to be careful? How many times had she smiled, shrugged, and chosen to live openly anyway? She had never been one to hide in the shadows. But now, those who loved her wondered if that same bravery had made her a target. And yet, despite the grief, despite the anger, they also clung to something else. The hope that her death would not be ignored, that it would force conversations people in Sikeston and across America had avoided for too long. The story of Nina Pop was no longer just a local tragedy. It had become part of a national reckoning. But before answers could be found, before her community could begin to heal, investigators had to confront the man they believed held the truth. Would Wilson finally reveal what happened inside Nina's apartment? Or would the silence that began with her death stretch on, leaving justice just out of reach? There's a lot more to discover, and some of it may change the way you view this case forever. If you want to know what happens next, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. James Wilson sat across from detectives, his arms folded tightly across his chest, as though that posture alone could shield him from the weight of their questions. The room was small, the air heavy with the smell of stale coffee and tension. Investigators had been circling him for days, armed with cell phone data, witness accounts, and the undeniable fact that he had been with Nina shortly before her death. Still, Wilson clung to his denials. "I wasn't there when it happened," he insisted, his eyes darting away. But the detectives leaned in, their voices calm yet unyielding. They knew that in cases like this, Silence could last for weeks, months, or forever. But they also knew cracks had already begun to form in his story. Wilson's inconsistencies piled up quickly. One moment, he claimed he hadn't seen Nina in weeks. The next, he admitted to being near her apartment the very night she died. For investigators, the picture was clear. He had been there. The only question was what had driven the encounter to such a violent end. As Wilson squirmed under questioning, Sikeston was grappling with its own unease. Nina's murder had thrust the small town into an unwanted spotlight. Reporters called daily, advocacy groups marched, and the national media painted Sikeston as another backdrop in a chilling pattern of violence against transgender women of color. Some locals resisted the attention, muttering that the case was being blown out of proportion. But for Nina's friends and for countless strangers who saw themselves in her story, the spotlight wasn't enough. They wanted justice. The weight of that demand pressed down on investigators as they combed through every scrap of evidence. DNA swabs, fingerprints, phone records. Each detail became a piece of a puzzle they could not afford to leave unsolved. Then, a break came. Forensic evidence from Nina's apartment began to link Wilson more directly to the scene. Traces that couldn't be explained away. Remnants of presence that went far beyond casual acquaintance. It was enough to solidify what detectives had long suspected. Nina had let Wilson into her life, into her home, and into her trust, and it had cost her everything. The arrest came swiftly after that. On May 15th, less than 2 weeks after Nina's body was discovered, Wilson was taken into custody. He was charged with second-degree murder, armed criminal action, and burglary. For those following the case, the news landed with both relief and sorrow. Relief that a suspect had been named. Sorrow that Nina's story had ended this way at all. At the press conference announcing the charges, local authorities insisted they were committed to justice. But the questions from the community were louder, sharper. Was this a hate crime? Had Nina been targeted for being a transgender woman? Or had she simply been another victim of intimate partner violence? The distinction mattered. To her loved ones, it was unthinkable to separate her death from her identity. To prosecutors, proving that identity was the motive required evidence they weren't sure they had. Meanwhile, Nina's face had become a symbol across the country. Her smile appeared in murals, in vigils, in online tributes that refused to let her name be forgotten. Say her name, people chanted, holding candles that flickered against the night. But the chants carried more than grief. They carried a warning. Nina was the 10th transgender person killed in 2020. By year's end, that number would climb far higher. Her story joined others, each one echoing the same grim refrain. Too many lives stolen. Too few answers given. Activists demanded systemic change. Protections. Recognition. Nina's death was not just about her, it was about a crisis that had claimed far too many. Yet in Sikeston, the focus narrowed back to Wilson. His trial would not only determine his fate, but it would force the question everyone was too afraid to answer outright. Was Nina killed because of who she was? Or because of who she trusted? Inside the jailhouse, Wilson remained largely silent. He offered no confession, no apology. To the public, he was a shadow, a man whose actions had left behind only grief and confusion. To the prosecutors, he was now the key to securing justice, however imperfect. But the silence around motive left a haunting void. If Nina's death wasn't labeled a hate crime, Would that diminish the truth of what had happened? Would it erase the reality that living openly as a transgender woman in America often carried mortal risks? Her friends wrestled with these questions late into the night as they gathered in circles of mourning. Some clung to memories of her laughter, her energy, the way she never backed down from being herself. Others seethed with anger, asking why the system had failed to protect her, why society had allowed violence like this to persist. By the summer of 2020, Nina's name had become both a rallying cry and a reminder of unfinished justice. Wilson sat behind bars, awaiting trial. Prosecutors promised to pursue the harshest penalties, but those who loved Nina knew that no sentence, no verdict, would ever bring her back. The unanswered question was not only whether Wilson would be convicted, but whether the world would learn from Nina's death, or whether her story would fade, just another headline in a year filled with tragedy. And as the months dragged on, with hearings delayed, and the case slowly moving through the courts, one fear lingered most of all. Would Nina Pop, vibrant and unforgettable, be remembered only for the way she died, rather than the way she lived? Justice seemed close, but appearances can be deceiving. Trials are not promises, and verdicts are never guaranteed. The truth about Nina's final hours still held secrets, and Wilson wasn't talking. So the question remained, hanging heavy in the air. Would the courts deliver the justice Nina deserved? Or would silence win again? There are many interesting things in this story, and the ending is not beyond everyone's expectations. If you want to know what happens next, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. The courthouse in Scott County stood like an old monument, its walls heavy with decades of secrets, confessions, and verdicts that had shaped countless lives. But when the name Nina Pop appeared on the docket, it wasn't just another case to pass through its chambers. It was a story that had already echoed far beyond Missouri, a story the world was watching closely. James Wilson, dressed in jail-issued clothing, appeared calm as he was led into the courtroom for the first time. His face revealed little, his eyes darting briefly toward the gallery before fixing on the table in front of him. For Nina's friends and advocates, that calmness was unbearable. How could someone accused of such brutality sit so still, so detached, as though the weight of what had happened meant nothing? The charges against him were clear: second-degree murder, armed criminal action, and burglary. Yet what lingered over the proceedings was not just whether Wilson would be found guilty, but whether the system itself would fully recognize the truth of what Nina's life and death represented. Trials rarely unfold quickly. Hearings were scheduled, postponed, rescheduled. The pandemic had slowed court systems across the nation, and Nina's case was no exception. Each delay felt like salt in a wound, every passing week a reminder that justice was still out of reach. For her loved ones, the waiting became its own form of torment. Meanwhile, advocates across the country continued to speak her name. At rallies in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, her face appeared on banners alongside those of other transgender women who had been lost that same year. Her story became part of a grim roll call, each name a plea for change, each candlelit vigil a protest against silence. Yet within Sikeston, a divide was growing. Some neighbors whispered that Nina's identity had been exaggerated by outsiders to push an agenda. Others stood firm, insisting that acknowledging her as a transgender woman was not politics, it was truth. And that truth mattered. As the legal process dragged on, Nina's family and friends found themselves caught between grief and activism. They gave interviews, telling the world about the woman she had been, her love of laughter, her determination, her kindness. They reminded people that she wasn't just a headline, she was someone's daughter, someone's friend. But beneath those memories lay anger. Anger that it had taken her death for people to notice her. Anger that she had to be remembered as a symbol rather than simply as Nina. And most of all, anger that violence against people like her was so frequent it no longer shocked the world as it should. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors faced their own uphill battle. To prove second-degree murder, they needed to show intent that Wilson hadn't simply lashed out in the heat of the moment, but that his actions had carried deadly purpose. To prove armed criminal action, they needed to establish the use of a weapon, and though the evidence pointed firmly in Wilson's direction, defense attorneys painted a different picture, suggesting the killing had been sudden, unplanned, and devoid of larger meaning. And then came the question that divided even the legal teams. Should this case be pursued as a hate crime? Activists demanded it. They argued that Nina's identity wasn't incidental. It was central that her being a black transgender woman put her in danger long before Wilson ever entered her life. But prosecutors hesitated. Hate crime charges were difficult to prove without explicit evidence. Slurs, messages, statements of intent. Without them, they risked undermining their entire case. So the trial pressed forward with the charges as they stood. But for those watching, the absence of hate crime charges felt like another silence. A refusal to fully acknowledge the world Nina had lived in, and the dangers she had faced every day. As months stretched into more than a year, the community of Sikeston struggled to move forward. Some wanted to put the case behind them, to let the courts handle it quietly. But Nina's friends refused. They organized memorials, vigils, and marches. They gathered at the spot where she had once lived, leaving flowers and photographs, as though to say, "You will not be forgotten." Not here, not anywhere. Nationally, Nina's story continued to resonate. Each time another transgender woman was killed, her name was invoked as part of the painful pattern. She was no longer just Nina from Sikeston. She was Nina Pop, a symbol of resilience, of visibility, and of the violence that too often followed. But for those closest to her, the symbolism was both comforting and cruel. They wanted the world to remember her, yes, but they also wanted her back. They wanted her laugh, her warmth, her presence. Symbols don't hug you. They don't pick up the phone. They don't fill the empty chair at the dinner table. As the trial approached its climax, one truth hung heavily over the courtroom and over the community. Even if James Wilson were convicted, even if he spent the rest of his life behind bars, no verdict could ever erase the fact that Nina was gone. Justice could punish a man, but it could not undo a tragedy. And so, the question that lingered wasn't just whether Wilson would be found guilty, but whether the system and the society around it would finally confront the reality of violence against transgender women. Or would Nina's death, like so many before hers, be filed away as just another case number? The answer was still uncertain, and the longer the silence lasted, the heavier it became. Would justice for Nina Pop be a verdict in a courtroom, or would it only come when the world stopped allowing stories like hers to repeat again and again? The trial was nearing its conclusion, but the outcome and what it would mean was far from clear. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of shuffling papers and the occasional click of a pen. For months, The people of Sikeston and far beyond had been waiting for this moment. The trial of James Wilson, accused of taking Nina Pop's life, had stretched on, weighed down by delays, legal maneuvers, and the heavy shadow of grief that hung over everyone who knew her. On the day of closing arguments, the air felt charged. Prosecutors painted Wilson as a man who entered Nina's apartment with a weapon and intent. They argued that Nina's death was not an accident, not a fight gone too far, but an act of violence that stripped a woman of her future. They spoke of her wounds, the brutality of the attack, the evidence tying Wilson to the crime. They reminded the jury that behind every detail was a human being, Nina, whose voice had been forever silenced. The defense countered, leaning on the idea of chaos, of heat of the moment, violence. They downplayed the intent, suggesting Wilson had acted recklessly. Not deliberately, they tried to create distance between him and the full weight of the crime, as though the act could be separated from its consequences. But no matter how many times they tried to redirect, Nina's face lingered in the minds of everyone watching. Her smile, her life, her story. When the jury retired to deliberate, the hours that followed felt unbearable. Every minute stretched, every second heavy with uncertainty. Outside the courthouse, supporters gathered, holding candles, signs, and photographs of Nina. They waited, prayed, and demanded justice, even as they feared disappointment. Then the word came. A verdict had been reached. Inside, the courtroom filled quickly. Wilson sat at the defense table, hands folded, eyes down. Across the aisle, Nina's loved ones clutched each other's hands. Some wept quietly, others stared straight ahead, bracing for whatever was to come. The foreperson rose, the paper trembling slightly in their hands. And then, in words that seemed to echo through the entire room, the verdict was read. Guilty. Wilson was convicted of second-degree murder and armed criminal action. The weight of the words landed like a stone dropped into deep water, rippling through the courtroom, through Sikeston, through every community that had carried Nina's story with them. Relief and sorrow collided in the same moment. On one hand, there was justice. Wilson would face the consequences of his actions. On the other, there was the inescapable truth. No sentence, no number of years behind bars could ever bring Nina back. Justice, in its cold legal form, was never going to be enough. When the sentence was announced, decades in prison, some in the gallery wept openly. Others closed their eyes, whispering prayers, knowing that while this chapter had closed, the deeper wound would remain. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted. Some cheered, others embraced, and many simply cried. For them, the verdict wasn't just about one man. It was about acknowledging Nina's life, about proving that her death mattered. It was a small step in a much larger battle. But it was a step nonetheless. In the weeks that followed, Nina's name was spoken with reverence. She appeared in news reports, in speeches, in conversations about systemic violence. Her story was retold again and again, not just as a tragedy, but as a call to action. For advocates, the verdict was both a victory and a challenge. It proved that accountability was possible, but it also underscored how rare such accountability could be. Too many other cases, they reminded the world, never even reached this point. Too many killers of transgender women walked free, their crimes reduced, excused, or ignored. And so, Nina became a symbol not just of loss, but of what justice could look like when the system refused to turn away. Yet for her family, The verdict brought only partial closure. They returned to a home that would never feel the same. They looked at photographs that now felt both precious and unbearable. They tried to navigate birthdays, holidays, and quiet nights without the sound of her voice. Her mother once said, "It helps to know that people are saying her name, but it hurts to know why." That contradiction lived at the heart of everything: pride that the world knew Nina, sorrow that it had taken her death for it to happen. In the years since, her story has remained part of a larger movement. When vigils are held for transgender victims of violence, Nina's name is there. When statistics are read out loud, her number is part of the count. And when communities gather to demand safety, justice, and recognition, her memory is invoked as proof that the fight is not abstract. It is urgent. It is human. It is personal. Nina Pop is more than a statistic. She is a reminder of joy stolen too soon, of the dangers that too many still face, and of the resilience of a community that refuses to be erased. The verdict gave an answer, but it did not solve the question at the heart of it all. How do we stop the violence before it begins? How do we build a world where women like Nina can live openly, freely, and safely? The truth is, her story doesn't end with a courtroom or a prison sentence. Her story continues every time someone demands change in her name, and as long as her memory endures, so does that fight. But Nina's legacy isn't only about justice or tragedy. It's also about the love she left behind, the community that continues to carry her forward, and the lessons her story forces us to confront. We'll explore how Nina's life and death became a turning point not just for those who loved her, but for a nation grappling with its failures and for a movement that refused to be silenced. Don't miss the final part of Nina's story. On a warm evening in May, 1 year after Nina's death, candles flickered against the night sky in Sikeston. People gathered in a circle, their faces illuminated by soft flames, their voices rising together as they spoke her name. Some had known her personally, neighbors, friends, co-workers. Others had never met her, but they came anyway, drawn by the need to honor her life and to demand something better for the future. For many in that crowd, Nina wasn't just a memory. She was a promise that the world could not keep ignoring the violence that had claimed her life and the lives of so many others like her. In the months following her murder, Nina became a name that echoed far beyond Missouri. Activists across the country carried her photo during marches. Her story appeared on banners, in speeches, in social media posts, shared thousands of times. She was held up as both a tragedy and a rallying cry. The Human Rights Campaign included her in their reports, reminding the public that her death was not an isolated act of violence, but part of a horrifying pattern. They pointed out that Nina was the 10th known transgender person killed in the U.S. that year, and the year wasn't even half over. By December, that number would climb. Each name, another life erased, another family grieving. Nina's story forced many people to ask difficult questions. How had her killer been able to slip through the cracks for so long? Why did it take days before the media even mentioned that she was a transgender woman? And why, even after a conviction, did so many others remain nameless, their stories untold? It wasn't only about one act of violence. It was about the silence that too often followed. For her friends, that silence was the most painful part. They remembered a woman who loved to laugh, who had a sharp sense of humor, who could light up a room. They remembered her dreams, her ambitions, her determination to live authentically, and they refused to let her be defined only by the way her life ended. The trial and the guilty verdict gave a sense of accountability, but it could not heal the deeper wound. For Nina's family, every day was a reminder of what had been stolen. Birthdays came and went, marked by empty chairs and quiet tears. Holidays felt hollow. There were moments when the grief felt unbearable. But there was also pride in knowing her name continued to be spoken not just in mourning, but in the call for justice. Her mother once said, "I want people to remember her for who she was, not just how she died." And that wish has been honored in ways big and small. Today, Nina's name is often read at vigils across the nation during the Transgender Day of Remembrance. Her story is told in classrooms, in advocacy groups, in online forums where people share her photo and pledge to fight for change. For young transgender women, she is both a warning and an inspiration, a reminder of the dangers they face, but also proof that their lives matter, that their voices deserve to be heard. The movement for justice has carried her forward, but it has also revealed a haunting truth. Even after Nina's case, the killings did not stop. Each year brings new names, new vigils, new statistics that feel unbearable to keep tallying. And each time, communities gather again, refusing to be silent, refusing to forget. Her death sparked conversations not only about violence, but about the broader systems that fail transgender people, from inadequate healthcare to job discrimination, from homelessness to police neglect. Advocates have pushed for stronger hate crime protections, better training for law enforcement, and more resources for LGBTQ+ youth. Some progress has been made. But progress has been slow, uneven, and too often overshadowed by new tragedies. And so, Nina's story lingers like an unfinished sentence, demanding to be continued by those willing to take up the fight. Looking back, it's hard not to wonder what her life could have been if she had been given more time. Would she have pursued new dreams? Would she have become an advocate herself, using her voice to push for change? Would she have built a family, traveled the world, grown old, surrounded by the people who loved her? We'll never know. That's the cruelty of it all, that an act of violence didn't just take her life, it took away every possibility of what she might have become. And so, the question remains, what do we do with that loss? Do we allow it to fade? To become another number in a report? Another headline forgotten after the news cycle moves on? Or do we carry it with us, demanding that the world recognize every Nina, every name, every life that deserves more than silence? Nina Pop's story is not just a tragedy, it's a mirror, forcing us to confront who we are and who we still need to be. Her name has been spoken at rallies, written on posters, etched into the hearts of those who refuse to forget. But the fight she symbolizes is far from over, because as long as transgender women continue to face violence simply for existing, the promise of justice remains incomplete. Nina Pop deserved more, and remembering her means demanding more from our communities, from our leaders, from ourselves. And that's the haunting truth. Nina's life may have been cut short, but her story isn't finished. It continues with every voice that refuses to stay silent. Because the real question is this: will we let her be just another statistic? Or will we finally build a world where women like Nina can live without fear? There's a lot more to this story that will leave you speechless if you find it worth listening to. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next case.